We're going to begin this module by looking at who Paul was. Of course, Paul doesn't begin as Paul. Paul actually begins as Saul. In fact, his name is Saul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus. Tarsus was a city on the coast, and it was a city in a province called Cilicia, which was in a region called Asia Minor. So straight away, we have a sense that Paul is different to Peter or the other disciples. That the other disciples all come from Galilee, come from that area in the northern part of Judea. They come from a place which is Jewish, with a Jewish culture, a Jewish custom, Jewish perspective. On the other hand, Paul, or Saul at this point, actually is in a different part of the world. He's in the Roman world. He's in Asia Minor. Today what would be called Turkey. And he's in that area there, living as a Jew in the diaspora. Now we've mentioned the diaspora before as being, the word diaspora means dispersion. And this was the dispersion of the Jews through the various occupations of the Holy Land. Particularly during the time of the Babylonians, that when the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem, many of the Judeans would have fled north. And some of those ones who would have fled north would have gone into Asia Minor. And it's in Asia Minor that they would have set up their communities, set up their synagogues, and they would have continued their life as Jews, but in the midst of a different culture, in the midst of the Roman culture. That's where Paul comes from. Paul understands, therefore, the Roman culture. He understands the culture in which he grew up. He would understand the people who would have been Greek-speaking rather than Hebrew-speaking. He would have seen the customs and the traditions and the religion of the Romans. That's Greek and Roman religion, the veneration of the emperor. Those kinds of things, even though the veneration of the emperor really was only beginning to get going during the time of Paul, we see that he would have been part of that process of development. He would have been part of what was happening in the Roman Empire. And so as a diaspora Jew, he has a different perspective. Now, it's a perspective that goes both ways. On one hand, it gives him an insight into Roman culture, but on the other hand, what it does as well is something very specific, and that happens with all first-generation immigrants. In fact, with all people who leave the homeland, is that often what happens is they become even more connected to their identity, to their tribal history. In fact, what it means is that potentially Paul was even more Jewish than the Jews who would have been in Judea. He would have actually had a closer connection to some of the Jewish things. We know by archaeological finds that in fact the synagogues of Asia Minor used to contribute vast amounts of money, first to the temple and later on to the synagogues of Judea. We know that happened. And so what we can see is that there was a real close connection, a pride, a celebration of the fact that they were Jewish. Even though that they were living in the diaspora, even though from the outside they would actually look just like the Romans themselves, on the inside they would felt even more Jewish than the Jews who lived in the Holy Land. Now, that comes through a lot of Paul's writings, that sense of his Jewishness and of the diaspora nature of that. So on one hand he can speak to the Romans, but on the other hand he preferred to actually be a Jew. On the other side of that, he was also highly educated. And education, even though today we may have a strong thing about education, about going to universities, and so sometimes we may look down on the people of the Bible as being illiterate and not understanding, we need to see that doesn't apply to Paul at all. Paul, in fact, most probably was a highly educated man. He could speak most probably Greek as his first language. We see that in his writings, is that his writings are written in a Greek which obviously shows that this is his first language. In fact, where he can't find a Greek word that says exactly what he wants to say, he just invents a new one. That shows a familiarity with language which goes beyond someone speaking in their second language. The other thing with him is that he gets told, or we get told by him in his writings, that he was also taught by one of the greatest rabbis of his day in Jerusalem, the Rabbi Gamaliel, and that he became a Pharisee. Now, of course, we've already mentioned Pharisees previously in this New Testament section, is that the Pharisees were the set-apart ones, the ones who believed that they needed to uphold the law. And you can see that within Paul's early life, that his passion for the law is the thing that overwhelmed so much of the rest of his life. Even overwhelmed his good sense and his good perspective, one that he atones for then for the rest of his life. So he's highly educated. He was educated, therefore, not only in the issues of Judaism, but we understand that he was also educated in the religions and in the perspectives and the philosophy of his own time as well, and the culture in which he lived, the Greek and the Roman culture. We see this, for example, when he goes on to Areopagus, and he's there debating with the Epicureans and the Stoics. At that point, when he's debating with them, he quotes, and the quotes that he gives both come from Epicurean or Stoic philosophers, indicating that he read them, that he knew some of not only about their philosophy, but he actually read the things that they were talking about. A sign of education indeed, which is able to look at more than just your own perspective, but to be able to understand and to read and to connect with the perspectives of those who are around you. So we see that he is a Jew of the diaspora. He is highly educated. The other thing that we see of him is that he was radically converted. One must never underestimate the importance of his radical conversion, because it's in the radical conversion that we see the truth in terms of what would then motivate Paul from that point onwards. We know that Saul is there at the stoning of the martyr Stephen. He's the one who holds everyone's cloaks while they go and they stone Stephen. Later on, we see that fervor, that sense of wanting to maintain the purity of Judaism, tells him that he has to go and to persecute the church. And it's on his way to Damascus to do that when he meets what he believes with Jesus himself. Now, this is a very important meeting, because for Paul, this wasn't just a meeting with a vision. This wasn't just a bumping into an angel or even into just the voice of God. He believed that he met with the resurrected Jesus. That's very important to understand some of what motivates Paul. Because what Paul then begins to see himself as is not just someone who's a missionary, not just somebody who is somebody who's sent out, but he actually becomes an apostle with a capital A. The same as the 11 after Judas commits suicide. Is that the 11 are the apostles because they were called directly by Jesus. Paul feels now that he has become the replacement for Judas. That he is the one who comes and is chosen by Jesus himself to become an apostle. And that's why he then says to himself, or says to the people, I, Paul, an apostle. Not just I, Paul, the one who is sent as an apostle, but an apostle. It's what gives him his legitimacy. It's why he believes that he can write to them and say to them the things that he believes and knows about Jesus. Not because he's just been one of the missionaries, but because he is actually one of the apostles. He speaks with the same voice that the 11 spoke with, who actually were with Jesus. So you can see straight away that there's a movement within that process. The last thing I want to say about him is that he's then, having lived among Gentiles for his childhood, we see that his focus and his connection particularly is to the Gentiles. He knows that Peter and the other apostles will look after the Jews, but he sees that his role is particularly to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews, that he may lead them because he understands their culture, their perspective, and their background. And therefore he is uniquely suited to be able to straddle both worlds, the world of Judaism and then the world of the Gentiles, and therefore lead them both to a relationship with Jesus.